The UN Security Council is urging countries to stop paying ransoms to kidnappers who fund terrorist groups. British UN Ambassador Mark Lyle Grant says more than £63 million has been paid in ransom money. While Britain and the USA do not pay ransoms, some European countries still do. Chris Voss is a former lead international kidnap negotiator with the FBI, the managing director at Insite Security. Hello, Mr. Voss.
Good evening. How are you?
Good evening. Very, very well. And this seems to relate to governments rather than businesses which are domiciled in their particular countries. Is that so?
Yeah, I think that's the initial thrust of what they're after because, as you pointed out, the reality is there are governments that are paying ransoms.
How does this actually affect the business? Because we're used to hearing about ransoms being paid, aren't we, after the fact by businesses who have lost somebody who has been kidnapped.
Well, it absolutely makes things worse. I mean, it causes people to mistrust governments around the world because people that are trying to deal with kidnappings on their own, whether they be commercial entities or private citizens, they see governments that say one thing and do another. And when they see one government that's paying ransoms, they have a tendency to believe that all of them do, and they lose faith in their governments.
So it really doesn't complicate the job of the negotiator, does it?
Well, it complicates things on every single level, and it also begins to make terrorists and kidnapping terrorists believe in particular that when a government says they're not going to pay ransom, that they're lying. And they hear governments, most of the governments who are paying ransoms will loudly proclaim that they don't. And the kidnappers, the terrorists, come to be taught that the governments are lying about it. So it encourages them to kidnap even more.
So do you know what the inspiration for this motion was, that the UN Security Council has just passed? I mean, who presented this?
Well, I think the British government has been pushing it for a while, and understandably so, because many of the neighbors in the European community are part of the problem. And I think they're trying to get people to understand that there are better ways of dealing with this than simply capitulating. So I think the British government is primarily the ones who have been behind this. What's the most recent trigger? What's the most recent additional problem? I don't know exactly what has caused the UK to push it harder, but it's been something that's been on their agenda for a while.
Could it not work for you as a negotiator, though, if it was, say, it was an employee of a British company and you just said as your starting point, well, as you know, the British government does not pay ransom? I mean, does that not help in any way?
Well, the kidnappers are smart enough to know that even though the British government doesn't pay ransom, lots of companies do. So, and kidnappers that are in the kidnapping business, in most cases, they've been doing it for a while, and they have a very good feel for whether or not they're going to get paid, because kidnapping has existed in that country for a while. So they're not terribly impressed by pronouncements of governments who say they don't pay, because they don't really care where the money comes from.
Can you, in fact, negotiate a release without a ransom?
There are very, very few times when victims are released without ransoms. It just doesn't happen. The kidnappers are going to want something in exchange for releasing a hostage, and if it's not money, and it's almost always money, then they want something of value. They want influence. They may trade a hostage for weapons. They may trade a hostage for other hostages, but something exchanges hands.
But they want something. As you've said, they will not take nothing. They won't just say, well, we'll think kindly of you and leave you alone. Or we won't hassle you, or we won't come after you and try to arrest you.
Well, yeah, they've been conditioned. They've learned from their experience to know that somebody is going to offer them something. It's probably going to be money. It's probably going to be a large amount of money. And from their perspective, ideally, if it's a government, they know it's going to be a very large amount of money. That's where the ransom demands become inflated, when governments weigh in with large amounts of money. So they know that if they wait and they threaten long enough, somebody's going to offer them something they want.
Our most recent sort of experience of this as an audience, if you will, is of course Tom Hanks and Captain Phillips, based on a true story. How would this affect small decentralized groups like the Somali pirates?
Well, the pirates learned from an instance like that once the U.S. government gets heavily involved, particularly if the U.S. military shows up, there's probably going to be gunfire. So they need to orchestrate it so that they simply pick victims that are not American citizens, and which comes to be the case in most kidnapping industries, if you will, around the world. They come to understand what the best victims are. The victims from the countries where the governments don't get involved in some sort of a military action. And they make it a point to simply stay away from those kinds of victims.
So, in other words, I'm not going to ask you for this list, but there is some list in the hands of these people which says nationals of the following countries are particularly good kidnap targets because their governments don't get involved and they pay ransom.
Yeah, they come to learn that. They absolutely come to learn that. Or whether they are, more than likely they're looking for targeted corporations, but particularly when it comes to the Somali pirates or any other place where kidnapping is an industry, they come to know what nationalities make good victims. And basically, the reality becomes that Brits and Americans are not good victims because the governments get involved in a way that the kidnappers don't like.
And then, isn't there something in this UN resolution after all? If it was backed up by something that would help some of these smaller countries actually stick to their guns and not pay ransom?
Well, yeah, that's a big if. You got people that are openly supportive of the UN resolution. Some of those countries, actually members of the Security Council, that you cannot count on for the government not to go ahead and pay a ransom.
I won't press you any further. Chris Voss, thank you very much. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Chris Voss, Managing Director of Insite Security. The International Court of Justice has waded into a maritime dispute between Chile and Peru. And with more on this, let's talk to Charlotte Carlson-Willis from the Santiago Times. Hello, Charlotte.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for helping us out here. What's the dispute about?
So this dispute goes back decades. The first treaty that the court listed as one of its considerations goes back to 1929. So it's basically a dispute over who controls what maritime territory between Peru and Chile, who share a territorial border. And it's very fertile fishing grounds, especially because the Humboldt current runs right through there. So it's been up for debate because the two didn't see eye to eye on where the line was between the two countries once it went over the ocean. And as the Hague said today in its decision, essentially throughout the years there's been various treaties between Peru and Chile, and they've discussed certain agreements to use the water between them, but never specifically laid out where the line was drawn, making it very obscure and leading to a court case that in The Hague it started in 2008. So it's been a long time coming, and the lead up has been pretty stressful for especially the fishermen in northern Chile.
Yeah. And does it look as if there's a winner then in this? I mean, who wins?
Well, leading up to the decision, Peru is extremely optimistic, and you could see the differences on either side of the border, where Peruvians were very much looking forward to the day and were expecting big crowds to hear the decision, whereas Chile kind of was playing it down and saying, everything's going to be fine, we'll follow the decision no matter what it says. And at the end of today, it was clear that Peru definitely gained land. And the issue in the dispute was basically that Chile claimed most of it,